This is a great writer's magazine, and I have a cup of tea just here, and it has the Mona Lisa on the outside. Let's take a sip. Lovely. Here is a representation of Emily Bronte in a painting, and of course she famously wrote Wuthering Heights. So let's open up the magazine and take a look. So Emily Bronte's dates were 1818 to 1848. Emily Bronte's life was intensely solitary. Her gifted brother and sisters were her only real human contact, and with her younger sister Anne above left. She created a world of childhood fantasy which remained essential to her in adult life. Only happy when roaming her native moors alone, she acquired not one single friend, but the strength of her personality inspired the deep admiration and love of all her sisters, but especially Anne's. Emily's extraordinary courage and inability to compromise resulted in one of the most passionate, violent and controversial books of the 19th century, and a unique body of poetry, all published shortly before her early death. As D.H. Lawrence wrote, "Life does not mean length of days. Poor old Queen Victoria had length of days, but Emily Bronte had life. She died of it." Okay, let me just take a sip of tea before we start. No coward soul. Life was never easy for Emily Bronte. Only alone on the moors, surrounded by the familiar sights of her private world, could she find peace and inspiration. The life of Emily Bronte was short, intense, and led in almost total seclusion. All that we know of her is what she reveals in her poems and her single novel, Wuthering Heights, and what has been left in the recorded memoirs of the few who knew her. Her sister Charlotte is a major source of information, but for some reason she destroyed many of Emily's papers after her death and suppressed the most significant aspect of her, that she was a mystic who drew inspiration not from what she called the world without, but from visions and moments of intense emotion when she felt a oneness with nature and the immaterial world. These fleeting moments were to provide her greatest happiness and were what gave shape to her life, her thoughts and her work. Emily Jane Bronte was born on the 30th of July 1818 at Thornton Parsonage in the parish of Bradford in Yorkshire. She was seen as a darling child, quite the pet nursling of the school, and was protected from the grim, miserable reality of the place. Returning to Haworth after an absence of 6 months, Emily remained at home for the next 10 years, though tutored by her father, from whom she acquired a passion for poetry. She grew up free from many of the restrictions normally placed on children. Under the watchful eye of Tabitha Ackroyd, Tabby, a widow of 56, employed at the parsonage as housekeeper, Emily would roam up to 20 miles a day over the moors, returning home at night to the austere little parsonage, and the bed she shared with Charlotte. During these walks, her imagination was fed with tales of the supernatural told by Tabby, whose memory stretched back to the turbulent times of the old century. Okay, I'm going to have a little bit of tea. Magical soldiers. Not long after the girls returned from Cowan Bridge, Patrick Bronte bought a box of toy soldiers for Bramwell. It was one of the most important events of the children's lives. Each sister chose a soldier. According to Charlotte, Emily's was dubbed Gravy because the face of the little soldier was so very grave, but Bramwell wrote that Emily called him Parry, after the Arctic explorer, Captain Edward Parry. Certainly Emily was later to weave tales around Parry's land, a never land bearing a marked resemblance to Yorkshire. Soon the Bronte children were writing stories based on the adventures of their adopted characters, jointly in the class town epic. Charlotte and Bramwell later paired off to produce the sagas of Angria, while Emily and Anne created the Gondel Chronicles. First formulated at the age of 12, the Gondels were to sustain Emily for the rest of her life. Indeed, as the years went by, Emily increasingly inhabited the fantasy world created by her own imagination. Excruciatingly shy in public, she rarely uttered a word to strangers, or even to those whom she had been introduced. On the rare occasions when Emily was thrown into the company of people outside the family circle, Charlotte's constant, anxious question was, how did Emily behave? Often she remained totally silent when spoken to. Okay, I'm going to have a bit more of my tea. Desperately homesick. Charlotte and even the timid Anne adapted sufficiently to become governesses and live, albeit unhappily, away from home. Not so Emily. When at the age of 17 she went as a pupil to Rowhead School, at which Charlotte was a teacher, it proved virtually impossible for her. Writing 15 years after the event, Charlotte said of her sister, "Liberty was the breath of Emily's nostrils. Without it, she perished. Every morning absence of only 3 months, Emily returned to Haworth, where she revived in spirit and in health. But gradually and relentlessly the shadows began to darken and close in on Emily and her family. At home, feeling herself to be a failure, she was thrown almost exclusively into the company of Branwell, a failure of Byronic intensity. Inevitably, the two drew closer together. Increasingly, she herself withdrew further from the world, despising its cruelty and meaningless social conventions. Only in the world of nature, in the silent, seemingly self-contained world of animals, did she feel any sense of affinity. Not surprisingly, she sought companionship and solace from her ever-increasing band of pets, pigeons, pheasants, geese, her dogs, Grasper and Keeper, her Merlin Hawk hero, together with numerous cats. When Aunt Branwell threatened to expel Keeper unless he was properly house-trained, Emily beat the obstinate beast about the head with her bare hands until, bloody and bruised, his spirit broke and he obeyed his mistress. Her own spirit and strength of will were indomitable, her physical courage phenomenal. Bitten by a suspected rabid dog, she cauterized the wound with red-hot tongs. Apart from her household duties, cooking, baking bread and managing household affairs, she taught herself German, played the piano and wrote her poetry. It was a quiet, simple, secluded life, all tight and right, as she described it in a diary paper of 1837. Yet there was a dark side to her nature, a feeling of inadequacy coupled with her feeling of separateness. Terrifically and idiotically and brutally stupid is the harsh judgment she passed on herself in a poem written in the same year when she was 18, which begins, "I am the only being whose doom no tongue would ask, no eye would mourn." She wrote, "'Twas grief enough to find mankind all hollow, servile, insincere, but worse to trust to my own mind and find the same corruption there." It was in that same year, 1837, that Emily made another attempt at living in the world. She went as governess to the Law Hill School, Halifax. It was a desperate, unhappy attempt. To her friend Ellen Newsey, Charlotte wrote, "I have had one letter from her, Emily, since her departure. It gives an appalling account of her duties, hard labour from 6 in the morning until near 11 at night, with only 1/2 hour of exercise between. This is slavery. I fear she will never stand it." Returning to Haworth on the 24th of April, 1838, Emily remained at home for the next 4 years, although Charlotte and Anne were to take up appointments as governess, and Branwell attempted to stave off his accelerating decline. Emily followed the old routine, becoming more indispensable around the house as Tabby grew less active. Alone in the tiny old nursery room, she created her own world. The room was simply furnished with a low armchair in which she wrote, and a camp bed pushed across the window from which at night she could gaze at the moon and the stars. There was no fireplace in the room or any form of heating. Comfort or physical care were things she disregarded. nothing from her own pen of her impressions of the Roman Catholic school into which she was plunged, her view of the school's proprietors, Monsieur and Madame Heger, or of the giggling girls with whom she was thrown into contact. All we have are the recollections of Charlotte as told to her biographer Mrs. Gaskell, the testimony of Monsieur Heger himself, and a memoir of a former pupil, Letitia Wheelwright. From Mrs. Gaskell we learn that Emily had taken a fancy to the fashion, ugly and preposterous even during its reign, of giggled sleeves, and persisting in wearing them long after they were gone out. Her petticoats, too, had not a curve or wave in them, but hung straight and long, clinging to her lank figure. To Mrs. Gaskell we also owe Monsieur Heger's opinion of Emily as egotistical. And exacting, exercising a kind of unconscious tyranny over Charlotte. And from Letitia Wheelwright we are told that Emily was a tallish, ungainly, ill-dressed figure, always answering our jokes with, "I wish to be as God made me." These are unflattering, humorless portraits. One can only guess, from the evidence of the poems and comments from Charlotte's letters, at Emily's unhappiness, but utter determination not to fail this time. Emily works like a horse, noted Charlotte in a letter to Ellen Newsey, and we know that Monsieur Heger had the highest opinion of Emily's intellectual powers. Okay, more tea. Passionately private. Miss Bell, Emily wrote Wuthering Heights between the autumn of 1845 and her 28th birthday in July 1846. It met with a favourable public response, though the literary establishment condemned it variously as disgusting, inhuman, evil, uncivilised, artistically immature. To Emily, the response was critically predictable and of little consequence. Within a year of the publication of Wuthering Heights, Branwell was dead, succumbing to the ravages of consumption, alcohol and drugs. At his funeral in October 1848, Emily caught a cold. Suffering from pains in the chest, shortness of breath and a hacking cough, she nevertheless refused to rest, take medicine, or permit the attendance of a doctor. Painfully thin and white, she continued to perform her daily tasks, rising at 7 in the morning, feeding her animals, returning to her cold bed at 10 o'clock at night. On the morning of the 19th of December, when she rose as usual at 7, the death rattle could be heard distinctly as she dragged herself downstairs. Charlotte gave her a last sprig of heather gathered from the moor. She was too far gone to recognise it. Lying on the horsehair sofa in the sitting room, she made a last concession to her sisters. "If you'll send for a doctor, I'll see him now," she whispered, dying moments later. She was buried at Haworth Church on the 22nd of December. Keeper, her devoted dog, howled outside her bedroom door for weeks after her departure. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that little reading all about Emily Bronte. This has been